This talk is 0 Days Should Not Be a Fire Drill by Steve and Tony. I do have some announcements before we go ahead and get started. First and foremost, we'd like to thank our sponsors, especially our diamond sponsors, LastPass and Palo Alto Networks, and our gold sponsors, Amazon, Intel, and Google, for their support. The support of our sponsors, along with donors and volunteers, is what makes these events even possible. Cell phones, I do want to give you a quick reminder. I'm sure you've heard it many times already. These talks are being streamed live, so as a courtesy to our speakers, please make sure your cell phones are silenced so as to not be disruptive. In the event of questions, which I believe we're going to have some questions time after, we're going to ask you to use the crowd mic. There's a mic in the middle. Again, these talks are being streamed, so for the sake of the audio on the YouTube, we ask that everyone speak into the mic. As a reminder, BSides photo policy strictly prohibits taking pictures of anybody without express permission of everyone who is in the frame. So, as these talks are being streamed, you will have access to the content later. So if you are concerned and would like to know more about the content, you can look at it later. And unless you're 100% sure that you have the express permission of everyone in the frame, please refrain from taking photos. Please make sure you have your masks on at all times. That is it. So with that, I will kick it over to Steve and Tony.
Thank you so much. So my name's Steve Winterfeld. I have responded to both data incidents, data breach, data loss, vulnerability announcement 0 days in banking, in retail, in government. And so I want to share some of those lessons with you. My co-presenter.
Hello, everyone. So thank you. We know you have a lot of choices for talks. One, thank you for showing up after happy hour. And also thank you for coming to our talk. This is me. We didn't really do intro slides, and then you threw this one together for me, so thank you. But thank you guys for being here. We're going to talk a little bit about 0 days, response to those. I've been in InfoSec since the late 90s. And whereas I feel like you've kind of been in the management, senior track, I've been the person who's like always been under the...
I do work.
You do sometimes.
You're inferring I don't actually do work.
But, when you're the person, with your boss breathing down your neck, like what your next move is very critical. So we're going to talk a little bit about taking the guesswork out of that process and how to make you more successful dealing with 0 days. So let's get started.
And so, big fan of The Office. I'm not going to lie, when I went and looked for an example and I found this clip, I lost about 3 hours watching clips of The Office. If you go to YouTube and you do fire drill in The Office, I'm not responsible for the next 3 hours you guys lose, but it's awesome. And essentially it is saying, Dwight had a fire drill and nobody did anything. So then Dwight had another fire drill, and it went the other direction. And so we want to say that, how often are we going to have a vulnerability coming out? And what time does it come out? Friday at 3 o'clock. So Log4j is going to come out before the holidays on a Friday at 3 o'clock. How much of our life should we be giving up, and what can we do to kind of turn that around?
Hey, just a quick note. The other most awesome episode of The Office is when Dwight cuts a face off of the CPR dummy and then puts it on his face and he's like, "Hello, Clarice." Remember that one?
And so when we get to questions, if you don't have a question about our talk, anybody's willing to can try to stump Tony on movies. Give him a line from the movie and he should be able to do it. So we should have some questions.
All right, so let's talk about some examples. Here's kind of a whole myriad of examples, and you'll notice too that these arrive in your, life in a number of different ways, right? SolarWinds, this is like supply chain, like a product that you're using. Where's that product installed? Who's the product owner? Who's the owner of the server that the products are installed on? That's a very different story from like a large scale, like Heartbleed or Log4j, a protocol related risk. Those require a whole different group of people to be contacted and to respond to this incident. And then going down, you look at things that are kind of status quo, parts of your infrastructure that you're using. They're obviously, there was a great talk the other day about DevSecOps and how it's failing. It was actually in this room. And the funny part is, most people always talk about dev and sec. The ops part is all the other things that have to happen for dev and sec to work properly, because implementation, deployment, who's using those systems, that's the operational aspect. And then obviously Stuxnet, a meltdown specter, these are things that most people aren't really prepared for in general, right? Because these are vulnerabilities or exploit attempts will be happening against systems at the very deepest root of your environment. So it obviously requires a different perspective.
And, again, this is a team sport. So as soon as I hear about what's going on, I've got two challenges. Where is it in my environment, and where is it in my critical provider's environment? And so, you need both those processes. You need to have thought through, as soon as I start on my checklist, I have a partner in vendor management who's going through. So at Nordstrom, we had, and my wife is very mad that I moved away from the Nordstrom discount, but we had 5,000 vendors. So then we had a category of which of those vendors had our customer data, which of them had credit card data. Some of them were they were in our system, so when we sold a pair of shoes, they sent us another pair of shoes. Some of them knew who bought it, what it was for. And so, that's the first one. The next is, where is it in my environment? How many have a lot of confidence in their asset management system? You're in trouble. How many people have an SBOM? Know where all their Log4j is and all that? That is awesome. Working on it, nice to see. I have this going next to me. Y'all take your mask off and yell.
You have an SBOM, but do you know if it's correct? If it covers all your stuff?
And then firmware. How many had a process when Spectre came out to patch firmware? For us, that was a new process we had to develop. And so, is IoT in your asset management system today? Or is that just a rogue system not considered to have data on it, so it's not in your asset management? And so the reason we built these out, just like when you're doing data breach, I think, third-party data loss, I lost data, I lost access through ransomware. There are classic scenarios you should go through in your planning, and we think this is a framework.
Yeah, the last point too, especially when you're talking about where these things exist in your environment. He just mentioned about SBOMs, right? A software bill of materials. There's a lot of, especially on the IoT side, the antithesis of SBOM is, do you have a problem maybe scanning into your environment because of risk of these fragile TCP stacks being knocked over from your asset identification scanning tools, right? So there's a big play there. Are you really catching everything that could be at risk here from these types of vulnerabilities?
And if you're trying to figure out why the Raiders are up there, it's because I live in Colorado, and this is one of the few safe places I can put a Raider logo up. So while I'm in Vegas, I'm going to take advantage of that opportunity. So I think part of the problem today is we think of a 0-day as an incident. And these are our two classic processes to deal with an incident. I'm saying that a 0-day is not an incident. It is a systemic problem, and it belongs in a different box. I think it belongs in crisis management. It's not something that's going to be finished out in the SOC more often than not. It's not a quick remediation with our tools. Again, it's a committee. It is a large phone call. You know, when the CEO hears about Log4j on NPR on his drive in, what's the first phone call you're going to get that day? You know, and so it's notification. It is having a coordinated response. Who needs to be notified for what? At what level of incident does it? So again, a customer is going to hear about Log4j and they're going to call the call center. And the call center is going to be asked, is my data safe from Log4j? Does your call center have any idea what they were just asked? So again, I think this belongs in crisis management because you need a message for people that call in. The next person that's going to call, when I was a CSO for Nordstrom Bank, is the feds, the OCC. They're going to call and say, what's the risk to the bank? Are you guys safe? So you have this constant stream, which is why I think we should move it out of incident response into crisis management and follow that same thing. And so one of the things that is, you know, which systems impacted by WannaCry, Log4j, pick your 0 day of choice, SolarWinds. What access was it to data? Tony was talking about SolarWinds, who was running it. I don't care who was running it, what was on it, what kind of information was involved. Is it customer information? Is it infrastructure information? Those are different reactions. Those are different people I have to notify. If there's customer information in there, now I'm calling privacy. They need to be on the phone call. If we lost it, I have 72 hours to notify somebody. And so you see where I'm going. And then again, I can't bang on this drum hard enough. I need you to be in lockstep with your vendor management or whoever's going to own all that others. And so for Log4j, what's a reasonable amount of, and this is manual, I haven't seen any program, and if somebody has, let me know, to automate this, where you're calling your key vendors and saying, are you secure from Log4j? You have my customer data. What's your plan? And what are they doing? They're doing the same thing you're doing, trying to figure out if you even have that protocol anywhere. So it's not a quick call and done.
No, go ahead. So this goes back to what we were talking about before. There are a lot of different people. If you look at the RACI chart at the bottom, this really depicts who was responsible for getting that ring into the flames to destroy it, right? You know, as you kind of map out who in your environment needs to be contacted, there's some really kind of practical things you can do. So one, if you've ever done like a tabletop exercise, think of something where you're under duress, right? So we work a lot with, large-scale web app attacks or DDoS attacks. And you'd be surprised going through a tabletop exercise before we go through the process of developing one, you just say, hey, you're under attack. What do you do? They're like, okay, we're going to call our 2 contact people in network ops and blah, blah, blah. And then they don't answer the phone because it's lunchtime or it's midnight where they live. What do you do next, right? Who's the second person to call on the call tree? How do you transfer responsibility? At what point do you open up a bridge and you say, hey, we're going to have a bridge that's open from now until this attack is remediated, to where anyone who needs to be notified of what's going on, they know this is the bridge to call into, right? There's a lot of procedures that can be done beforehand to save time. Because when you're under duress, when you're hard down, or if you've failed over to your failover data center, just say, and God forbid your failover data center is not failing over, everyone starts to get red in the face. They start to make poor decisions. And you have, somebody that looks like this standing over your shoulder. Just that was not cool. But you have like you have your boss looking right over your shoulder, and you're just like, I've got to focus. I've got to remain calm. The more planning you can put into this whole procedure here, for who's involved, who owns what, who are the secondary contacts, all that good stuff, that has to be done beforehand. Because the longer you wait, when it eventually does happen, you're not going to be able to respond in time, right? You're probably going to have a poor experience.
And that's why I love that when you're building things like this and then you do the exercise, you do two things. One, you discover that, Tony built this and it says create fellowship, and there's two people responsible for that. Is that legitimate? Can two people own the process? I tend to say a RACI can only have one R.
Well, Frodo was a key contributor to the ownership of that process.
Then he should be consulted.
In fact, some might say he was not the most equipped to take the ring on that journey.
And that's why I say, I think you have it anyway.
Yeah.
And so exercises are critical to both make sure everybody knows who owns it, how they own it, if it's a partnership, how they're going to come to resolution, and also to set expectations. So for those of you who have been involved in some kind of a major incident, the first thing you get from the leadership is, what's the status? And we want an update every 30 minutes. And then you turn to your SOC analyst and you say, you go do your work, and when you have something, come tell me, and I'll update them every 30 minutes. You don't need to come back to me every 30 minutes, because guess what? How long does it take to troubleshoot something? Until you figure out what's wrong. I love those hypothetical questions. When are you going to know how much data was lost? Never.
When I can tell it's not happening anymore.
And so building expectations, building the team, making sure people know their role. I can't emphasize how important this is. It is key, especially now with the high turnover all of us are experiencing. How many of us have that one guy who left was the historical knowledge of all your firewall policies? So these exercises are really important.
So let's take a little journey back in time. Even further than this, let's go back to 2014 when there was an SSL vulnerability called Heartbleed that was disclosed. We found out that it had been actively exploited in the wild for a previous 2 years to that. Right? So this was one of my first big experiences when I started Akamai. And to the point of, who gets notified, before anything was fixed, we had to make a public press announcement, right? Because everyone knows there's TLS or SSL certs deployed globally across 350,000 servers that are, in front of big banks, big social media companies, big commerce platforms. So we probably have to give some kind of notification what's going on. That process, what's really interesting about this is we learned a ton of lessons from this. And we've announced this publicly, but the initial response was our implementation of OpenSSL was not vulnerable to this exploit, and we started sharing what our implementation was. And then 3 days later, a researcher came back to us and said, hey, you guys are still vulnerable. Here's a POC of the exploit still working. So we had a 3 or 4 day lack of a head start on going out and rekeying all of our certs globally. That's a huge impact. And when you go through that process, you really start to find out, man, a lot of people need to touch a lot of systems at the same time in order to get this done expediently. So it's like, hey, can you spell computer? Congratulations, you're on the task force, right? So flash forward to the response to Log4j, and here we have that's eight long years after that, and we started seeing that all of the things that we learned from those initial Heartbleed and then later Poodle, we put into action to have a really proper response for Log4j. One, the visibility around where it exists in your environment, that's a real key issue. But more so, we saw so much exploitation attempts against our customer base. At one point, I think 60% of our customers were being hit by exploitation attempts. As we started to kind of weed out and we started to see patches come out, then we could start doing reduction of that and say, okay, these are vulnerability scanners that are testing for the exploit based on this vulnerability scanner code that it had. And we can start to take that out. But this was a really massive, massive problem.
And so this is where we've kind of diverted from our generic example to an example of a security vendor. So how many of you work for a security vendor of some flavor? So this is where you're
Good for
protecting
you guys.
yourself.
Never change.
It's where you're protecting yourself and simultaneously looking at your product and how your product can protect your customer. And so what we're talking about here is what we were seeing hitting our thousands of customers on our web application firewall.
And this is where you really kind of break out, and there's intricacies to this, right? So like we have an adversarial resilience team that really looks at how adversaries might and do try to bypass or do try to bypass Akamai platform security. So securing the platform means making it continue to run properly. But then the other side is anything that's deployed on behalf of a customer, how are those configurations and that implementation secured separately, right? So again, it goes into the RACI chart again, who's responsible, who's going to be brought into a task force. If we go to the next slide, we'll see that, so the red graph here on the right side is percentage times 10. So these are 60% at one point, 60% of our customers were being hit by these attacks. And then you'll notice here as well, as new exploit code is being released, we saw a huge influx in attacks that test out that new exploit code, right? Because anytime new code is released in a 0-day, there's a race against the clock. Like, when is this going to get patched? If I'm going to exploit it, the time is now. So we see like a fevered pitch here. You'll see around the a few days after Christmas time here, massive increase in attack traffic. Now, some of this was attributed to scanning tools that got the previous patch, and then they were testing, obviously. But again, this is the interesting case about this, again, that I mentioned is 92% of the attacks that we saw were being blocked far away from where the exploit was actually vulnerable. So this is where you come into what is your model for securing your environment? Do you have like virtual patching capabilities where the exploit may still exist, but you're buying time by blocking the visibility of that, from the adversaries, right? So this, again, it was a great learning experience for us.
And one of the key lessons is never let a good crisis go to waste. And so I want to talk about the three aspects we have here. The first is protecting our customer. On day one, you have to get the message out to whoever your partners are, whoever your customers are. If it's internal IT, if it's making sure your third parties are working on it, if you're supporting customers, if you're a bank managing wealth, you're notifying people what you're doing. So, that educating and getting the message out that you're on top of this is critical. I find it interesting that this was a huge chance for people to reevaluate the risks they've accepted. How many people have a security control in monitor mode only? Why? Because we're worried about the friction.
Be honest. I was going to say be honest, but yeah, no need to do that.
How many people won't raise their hand no matter what I ask? Okay, good.
Nice. Psychological warfare. I like that.
So, this is something that is fascinating because when this came out, the leadership was now asking, are we blocking this? Not security begging, can we please put in a blocking rule? And so they took advantage of it. I saw some customers change their entire platform to block mode, and some customers only block on the Log4j rule. And so there were, again, this is risk tolerance. It's the customer experience, security balance out there. But a lot of lessons learned around, this is an opportunity to go back to leadership and talk about your risk appetite, which is an FFIEC banking term. Going back to what's your corporate willing to say is the right thing to do.
Hey, on that point, will you talk a little bit about, you mentioned, someone's driving to work as a board member, they hear, hey, the latest, earth-shattering vulnerability that you're all going to die because of. Talk a little bit about the involvement of the board when things get to that level, how it changes the scope of how you have to respond to it. From a notification perspective, from a now they want to be updated every 10 minutes, just like your boss would normally want to be. What's that look like?
So my experience has been 10 years ago, our boards had more Luddites on them than technically competent people. If you don't know what a Luddite is,
I'm going to Google that.
It's worth going to Wikipedia. I'm not going to go down that rabbit trail, but it's one of my favorite derogatory terms. And so the thing we've seen is how many businesses now don't have a critical part of the business that depends on IT. It's fewer and fewer every year. And so boards are now talking about the business strategy in terms of technology capabilities. And so we're seeing more of them educated. More of them, they've always talked about risk. They've never talked about technologies. And so the board doesn't want to know what Log4j does. They don't want to know what open source is. You are not a technology advisor. You're a business partner. And if you go up as a CISO, as a technology advisor, you're not going to knock it out of the park. And so you're going to go up there and you're going to talk about risk. And on day one, you're going to say, right now, we have risk around customer data in these 3 places. And we put a segmentation policy. We have additional monitoring. We have an immediate patch process once a patch comes out. We've implemented a WAF or whatever, this is. If it's SolarWinds, it's a product, then, there's a different set of what you have to do. Are you going to uninstall it? What's the impact of the business? Again, rabbit trails I won't go down. But it's going up and talking about the impacts and the risks to your business.
And if you go back 10 years, 10, 15 years, how many companies didn't rely solely on the internet to do their business? So whereas you might be able to say, just say you're in SecOps or you're in incident response, and there's an infrastructure problem, it's so easy to kind of pass that over and say, oh, that's a platform issue, or that's the cloud people that have to worry about that, or that's or there's some kind of, if there's an internet outage, if there's anything that could affect your company making money, trust me, anyone who could possibly fix it is going to be in scope for, a resume writing opportunity, right? So the whole idea here is that as more organizations are relying on the software stack, the internet stack to viably have their business function, it changes the conversation. It changes the education of the board. A lot of the board now are a lot more technology savvy versus 10, 15 years ago, they were just kind of pure play business people advising on the next strategic step to take. So I think that's an interesting change too. And we should be cognizant of that when it comes to how we deal with our superiors up the chain, because you have to understand where they're coming from too.
And you probably haven't heard of this organization, so you may want to write this down, but there are a lot of industry ISACs out there.
Never heard of it.
And that's his favorite topic. And so that's another thing that you've got to decide to put in your process. When you have these, are you going to call in and see if there's an ISAC call? FS ISAC, healthcare ISAC, hospitality and retail, at one point there were 15 major ISACs. I think there's more than that now.
I think there's like 24 now or something like that. It's pretty pervasive.
But where are you going to go to your peer group? What communities are you going to reach out? What external resources are you going to leverage? And there's a bunch of them out there. DHS is going to put something out there about a week after you need it. But again,
no offense, DHS. No offense is what I meant to say.
And so, but I will tell you why it's worth going and looking at that is it's a great lessons learned. It's a great checklist to see what you did and what other people did. The last thing is expanding our toolkit. For each one of these, there are different remediation or mitigation techniques out there. And so kind of think through that first set we went through. What tools do you have in your toolkit and where do you have gaps? We talk about segmentation. We talk about access control. We talk about, if you're in your API environment, what are the different tools you have or levers to pull during these incidents? So again, I want to talk a little bit about, what is the next step? What should we be doing? And I've really tried to make a case here that we should shift off of thinking about a 0 day as an incident, a SOC-owned problem, and expand this to be what it needs to be. A communication exercise, a RACI with IT, vendor management, forensic, the pen test team going out and
PR
checking.
even, public relations even. If you have to give incident response or notification that, hey, you are looking at this, or maybe because of the vulnerability, you had to take systems offline for patching, all of that has to be in scope.
Absolutely. And so, if you don't have a crisis management process you can go leverage, then we need to have another discussion. But for those of you who do, I think this is a great, I'm a huge advocate of NIST, simply because NIST is something that you can show the auditors as a best practice. So, something like, moving NIST 190, I think, is for APIs. I think we have NIST 207 for Zero Trust. There are a lot of special pubs out there that you should be pulling verbiage from, best practices from, and crisis management. Well, and don't forget that first incident response cycle I showed you is from NIST as well. And that's more the traditional 853. So go out there, build the documentation, exercise, practice this. I know you wanted to talk about that as well. And cover a little bit about the SBOMs and the vendor management there.
Yeah, we talked earlier about the idea of an SBOM, right? So what software exists in your environment, whether or not it's your responsibility to patch it. Years ago, I used to use tools like Secunia, which are agent-based tools that will install and basically map out all the software that's installed on that system and then compare it to the latest patch update for each of those different software packages. Things like that exist now. I know they got bought out. They're doing similar work, though. But the idea here is if something exists in your environment, eventually it can come back and bite you, because you know who's going to be looking for your 20-year-old software version of whatever package you're using on one of your old web servers. The bad guys. The bad guys are going to be looking for that. And it's not just by happenstance. It's the path of least resistance. I don't have to use a 0 day if there's a 7-year day out there that hasn't been patched yet because you haven't gotten around to it. So that's one of the big pieces. And again, to the whole point of walking through this and practicing it, I can't stress that part enough. Pretend like you are going back through Heartbleed. Say, what is it going to take for us to rekey all the private certs, and then redeploy the certs to our other machines. What's that going to take? Who's going to be involved? Just practice that. And without going through a process like that, if something like that were to happen again, you're going to be starting from square one. And that's what we're trying to avoid here. We do a lot of this when we work with our customers and our clients, just because if something were to happen, we don't want to be the ones who are in the way of them getting their problems fixed, even if it's nothing to do with us. So we're trying to help kind of grease the skids, so to speak, of those things working better within our customer base. So if something does happen, again, we're not the roadblock.
Yeah, and so again, going back to that first slide, the different categories that you should do exercises around. And then there are different types of exercise. There's this typical tabletop where you can just sit down with the RACI and talk through the RACI. And you should have a timeline and steps. Notification, discovery, patch release. You'll have some key milestones in your exercise for each of these. And some of these will involve leadership. Some of these will be more technical in nature. So think about the kind of exercises you want. And I think they're all beneficial.
So we put up some resources here. One, our threat research group has a bunch of great publications. I was just talking at the other conference across the road about our gaming state of the internet security report. So cool findings that we found. Basically, if you own a gaming system or if you've been during the stay-at-home order, I like to call it the stay-at-home and game order, because as a gamer, it's like, you mean I get to be at home all the time? And if I'm on a boring call, I can be on oh, is this being recorded? Oops, I'm just kidding. I can be playing something, right? So also I have ADD, so I work better with that kind of distraction in the background. Our security blogs, again, a bunch of cool stuff here, just around things that we're finding. We have a security researcher named Larry Cashdollar. He has something like 350 CVEs to his name. We call him the WordPress killer, although he has recently kind of branched off from WordPress. And on YouTube, we have some developer videos. A lot of these are developer kind of advocacy videos talking about how you guys as security personnel can interface with your development teams better. And again, how we try to do that within our organization as well. And then the last piece is we are hiring. So if you guys think it'd be cool to work for a multinational cloud security organization, we do really cool stuff. I've been at Akamai for
We hire just about anybody.
That's true. I snuck in. But I've been at Akamai for 9 years. It's the first time I've ever worked for a vendor. But I've been in SecOps since the late 90s. So it's really been eye-opening kind of seeing all the cool stuff that a company like us are doing. So that's my
I would
little
also
advertisement
say
there.
the blogs, a lot of the stuff we talked about for Log4j, you'll see in our blogs, a lot of the charts. Tom Emmons is great about DDoS. Orr is great about phishing. I'm really proud of some of our research. All right, who's gonna stump us?
Now's the time. Well, we don't have to go there. You don't have to stump us. But if you use the microphone, it'll be recorded for the people at home as well.
Okay, really important one. Thanks for this. This was great. Who played the woman's lead role opposite of Roger Moore in The Spy Who Loved Me?
Okay. I recently just watched all of those again with my wife because we were like, dude, these are classic.
You call your wife dude?
No. I was just saying, dude, like, these are classic. Okay, shut up, Steve. That's a tough one. We should have put a caveat that said
He's better with lines. I'll give you that.
any movie that is from the what? Well, I
No,
can't
go
give.
ahead. No, go ahead. Be you.
All right, I don't know.
Dude, it's too late for the caveats. Okay, I got a better question for you. I know one you can answer.
Yeah.
So the PR part you touched on is really essential. I think that when a breach happens, eventually your tech guys are going to figure it out. But if you botch the PR, your rep is screwed for a long, long time.
Yeah.
If you're a smaller group and you don't really have people that are specialized in that area, how do you handle that?
That's a great point. So I will go back to my firsthand experience in 2014 with Heartbleed. We put together a group which was our PRAR team, our platform security architects, some other kind of security evangelist type people, and our CISO. And we all kind of worked through literally like the wording of what this press release was going to look like, what we were going to say. Sometimes you can't say too much.
Exactly.
But sometimes if you don't say enough, it's like, are you giving proper warning to someone else who may need to take care of this, right? So it's a very fine balance. And I think ultimately, depending on what organization you're a part of and what your responsibilities are, there's legal responsibilities, but also ethical responsibilities. I think all of that has to be taken into account. So it is, Steve, I don't know if you have a more specific answer, but.
So, I mean, transparency equals trust, and loss of trust is hard to recover from. That said, I think about two things during a breach. I have a person assigned who's going to tell me if I'm not following our process. Because if I don't follow our process and the class action lawsuit discovers that, I'm going to be sued for negligence. I have my chief legal officer, my general counsel, hire my forensic people, so the forensic evidence is under attorney-client privilege. So, I mean, that's how I'm thinking. At the same time, when I'm talking to the board, I'm saying we don't have enough to say. If we say we lost 3,000 records today, we may come back tomorrow and say, oh, make that 1.5 million.
Yeah, big difference.
And so it doesn't sound transparent to say we're still trying to figure out what's going on. Not hard to get the marketing and PR people to sign off on that statement. So it's a delicate balance. I would lean into a culture of transparency and talk to legal and talk to PR about sharing upfront.
Yeah, thanks for that. What I'm seeing in general is people weighing CYA against
yes,
like, what is the damage, right? So that seems dangerous. If there's like a framework that really makes it clear this is your legal obligation to disclose this portion versus, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah. And I think they've attempted to create frameworks around, one, from a vulnerability perspective, if you have any risk involved there, responsible disclosure, and then also breach disclosure is being handled a lot more from the compliance level, where they're like, hey, this is what you have to do if something were to occur, as per the compliance that you've opted into, that you've agreed to, right? So
there's also some psychology around admitting mistakes. The classic example that I always remember is Warren Buffett every year puts a mistake he made in his annual report because he has so much more credibility by doing that. And the one year he didn't feel like he had a good oops, he talked about the oops from the year before.
yeah.
So there again, transparency generally wins. And it also goes back to how negligent you were in the first place.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for the question.
So you guys are a huge company, very technical, serving very technical customers who are serving their very large, very technical companies. I work at a startup, and I've got 3 engineers. I'm in QA, by the way. I'm not even a security person.
Thank you for your service.
I try. Are there resources on your blogs for how to get the rest of your non-technical team on board with these ideas, with these, for lack of a better term, war games about, like, how do we bring everybody into these? Because I used to work in support, so I'm really good at writing effective apologies and emails that don't get us in legal trouble. there's a lot of resources outside of just the technical parts that can be looped in here and be really helpful for CYA, for making the apologies, for doing the press releases. Do you have more resources for how I can get my marketing team interested in this for what happens if HubSpot goes down and we
In
lose
planning for what happens, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Do you want to take a stab, Rob?
So first of all, there are great industry-specific podcasts. And one of the things I like to do is figure out how somebody likes to learn. I prefer to read. My ADD makes audiobooks impractical. What was that? And then, other people have different methods. So find out what they like. Sans has a lot of great examples. They're great to plagiarize from. YouTube has a lot of great resources. Like I said, I plagiarize a lot from NIST. ISO is a cost, so I don't. If you're international, you want ISO over NIST, but it's not free. And again, belonging to a community. There are so many communities out there beyond the ISACs that the more people you can plug into them. But, like I said, for your marketing, this is hilarious. So I was talking to the marketers, and they're like, the book Influence is great, we use it. And then I'm talking to my fraud expert, and he and I were doing a talk together, and he's like, well, all the fraudsters know that the book Influence is the best book to learn how to be a good fraudster. And so,
charisma
that's
for everybody.
Yeah.
that's a resource that went right to the top of my reading list.
Well, I think the point too about join a community. Another good piece of advice might be build a community within your organization. Say, hey, I really want us to be prepared for what happens if something catastrophic were to happen. Find stakeholders within each different part of the organization and all have lunch together one day. And then maybe the next time you say, or at the lunch, maybe you say, hey, it'd be great for us to have like a monthly meeting just to kind of talk about all the pieces that fit into this. And then maybe from that, you guys can start assigning responsibilities or areas of expertise even. A lot of times people's areas of expertise is not the role that they're currently working in. I worked for years at a company where I was like the do everything person. And it turns out, I would rather do less. So from that perspective, not just less, I would rather not have to do everything the hard way. I want to automate myself out of a job kind of situation, right? So, but I would say build a community within your organization of people who are like-minded that think there might be a risk if something were to happen. And how are you guys going to respond to it? So
Awesome.
hopefully that helps.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm definitely.
And if I come up with anything else, I'll post it on Twitter.
Thank you.
So follow me on Twitter. It's not a shameless plug. Nobody follows me. I don't know why. I'm just not interesting, really, but I will share something if I find it, okay?
Awesome.
So,
Thank you so much.
no
Also,
problem.
my favorite line that no one seems to get, I am an excellent driver.
I'm an excellent driver.
Excellent driver. So I'm going to go.
Yes, well, now this is like really putting me on the spot. That is 80s. Is that Weird Science? It's not. Okay. All right. What? You got it? Okay. I don't want you to stump me and get the one that she... Okay, anybody else know it? Oh, yes. Shh. Okay, to be honest, I probably should have put some caveats at the beginning of this whole talk. It's been for naught. Anyway, if there's no other questions, anybody else have anything else? All right, thank you guys for being here. Really appreciate it, and have a great weekend.